Between 1979 and 2003, one man controlled Iraq's oil wealth and spent more than $2 billion of it on personal palaces. 80 separate compounds scattered across the country. Each required years of construction. Each employed thousands of workers. Materials arrived from Italy, Brazil, Czechoslovakia, marble for floors, crystal for chandeliers, gold for bathroom fixtures. The average palace spanned dozens of acres and contained over 100 rooms. Some sat empty for years, fully staffed and maintained despite never being occupied. The construction timeline coincided exactly with Iraq's worst humanitarian disasters. The Iran-Iraq War killed hundreds of thousands. UN sanctions in the 1,990 seconds caused mass starvation. Through all of it, palace construction accelerated. The Iraqi people were forbidden access. These were not government buildings. They were monuments to Saddam Hussein's power, built with wealth that belonged to the nation. Understanding how this happened requires going back to the beginning, not to 1979, but to the discovery that made it all possible. October 14, 1927, a drilling crew working for the Turkish Petroleum Company struck oil near Kirkuk in northern Iraq. The well erupted with such force that it took 8 days to bring under control. Workers estimated the flow at 95,000 barrels per day, an extraordinary volume for the era. The discovery confirmed what geologists had suspected for years. Iraq sat atop some of the largest petroleum deposits on Earth. The territory itself was barely a decade old. The modern nation of Iraq had been created in 1920 from 3 former Ottoman provinces: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, Basra in the south. The British had assembled these regions under a mandate from the League of Nations following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. King Faisal I ruled nominally, but British advisors controlled the government and economy. The oil belonged to foreign companies. The Turkish Petroleum Company, later renamed the Iraq Petroleum Company, was a consortium of British, French, Dutch, and American interests. They held exclusive rights to Iraqi oil under terms negotiated with the British Mandate authorities. Iraq received a small royalty, roughly 20 cents per barrel. The companies kept everything else. Production expanded rapidly through the 1,930 seconds. Additional fields were discovered near Mosul and in the south near Basra. The Rumaila field, straddling the border with Kuwait, proved especially rich. By 1934, Iraq was exporting over 4 million barrels annually. Revenue reached several million pounds, a substantial sum, but a fraction of the oil's actual value. The money transformed Iraq's infrastructure in visible ways. Baghdad gained paved roads and electric lighting. Schools opened in cities that had never had them. The first modern hospitals were constructed with equipment imported from Europe. But most revenue left the country entirely, flowing to London, Paris, and New York as corporate profits. Iraqi nationalists watched this arrangement with growing anger. The oil came from Iraqi soil. Iraqi workers labored in the fields and refineries under brutal conditions, yet foreign shareholders collected the wealth. Political movements demanding change gained support throughout the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds. Everything changed in 1958. A military coup led by General Abdul Karim Qasim overthrew the monarchy. King Faisal II was killed along with much of the royal family. Qasim declared Iraq a republic and immediately challenged the oil companies. He demanded renegotiated terms or nationalization. The companies resisted. They reduced production in Iraq and increased output from other Middle Eastern fields. The economic pressure was meant to force Qasim into submission. It had the opposite effect. Iraqi resentment toward foreign control intensified. Qasim was overthrown and executed in 1963. The Ba'ath Party took power briefly, then lost it, then regained control in 1968. This second Ba'ath coup brought a generation of hardliners who had no patience for foreign oil companies. They had watched nationalization succeed in other countries. Libya had done it in 1970. Algeria had taken control of French petroleum assets. The model existed. On June 1st, 1972, Iraq nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company. The government seized all foreign-owned oil infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, and export facilities. Compensation was promised, but minimal. The companies protested to their governments. International pressure followed. None of it mattered. Iraq controlled its own oil for the first time. The revenue impact was immediate and dramatic. In 1971, under the old royalty system, Iraq earned roughly $840 million from oil. In 1973, after nationalization and amid rising global oil prices, revenue reached $1.8 billion. The following year, 1974, as OPEC price increases took full effect, Iraq's oil income exploded to over $5.7 billion. By 1975, revenue exceeded $8 billion annually. The Treasury had never seen anything comparable. Iraq's entire national budget before nationalization had been measured in hundreds of millions. Now billions arrived each quarter. The Ba'ath government launched an ambitious modernization program. New hospitals were constructed across the country, equipped with the latest medical technology. Schools multiplied. Literacy programs reached into rural areas that had been neglected for generations. The University of Baghdad expanded. Branch campuses opened in Mosul and Basra. Electricity reached villages that had never had it. Water treatment facilities were built. Sewage systems were installed in cities where residents had relied on open drainage. The improvements were real and substantial. By the late 1972s, Iraq had one of the highest literacy rates in the Arab world. Healthcare was free and accessible. University education was free. Women attended universities in significant numbers. The Ba'ath Party promoted secular nationalism and socialist economic policies. The oil wealth was being invested in human development. Production continued rising. Iraq possessed the world's third-largest proven reserves, behind only Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Kirkuk field alone could produce over 1 million barrels daily. Rumaila in the south added another 1.5 million barrels per day at peak capacity. Dozens of smaller fields contributed additional output. By 1979, Iraq was producing nearly 3.5 million barrels per day. At prices averaging $30 per barrel, gross revenue approached $100 million daily, over $35 billion annually. The numbers were staggering for a nation of barely 13 million people. The centralization of this wealth created power unlike anything Iraq had experienced. The government controlled every dollar. The Ba'ath Party controlled the government. And within the Ba'ath Party, a smaller group controlled everything. The Revolutionary Command Council made all major decisions. 9 men, later reduced to 5, determined how tens of billions of dollars would be spent. No democratic oversight existed. No independent judiciary could review spending. No free press could investigate corruption. The oil revenue flowed directly into government accounts. From there, it went wherever the leadership decided. Infrastructure projects consumed billions. Military spending took even more. Iraq purchased weapons from the Soviet Union, France, and other willing sellers. The arsenal grew to include tanks, fighter jets, artillery, and increasingly sophisticated equipment. The military expanded from 100,000 troops in the early 1972s to over 200,000 by decade's end. But even with massive spending on hospitals, schools, and weapons, vast sums remained. The surplus sat in government accounts, available for whatever purposes the leadership chose. No constitution limited their discretion. No parliament held them accountable. By the mid-1972s, Iraq's oil revenues exceeded $20 billion annually. The treasury was full. The government controlled everything. And within that government, one man was maneuvering toward absolute power. April 28, 1937. Saddam Hussein was born in the village of Al-Auja, roughly 100 miles north of Baghdad, near the town of Tikrit. His father died or abandoned the family before his birth. Records are unclear. His mother remarried a man named Ibrahim Hassan, who reportedly treated the boy with cruelty. The family was poor. Saddam grew up illiterate in a mud brick house without electricity or running water. At age 10, he moved to Baghdad to live with an uncle, Khairallah Talfa. The uncle was a former army officer who had participated in a failed 1941 coup against British influence. He had been imprisoned and developed an intense hatred for both the British and the Iraqi monarchy they supported. He filled Saddam's head with pan-Arab nationalism and stories of resistance. The education was as much political as it was academic. Saddam attended secondary school in Baghdad, but showed little interest in formal studies. What interested him was politics. In 1957, at age 20, he joined the Ba'ath Party. The party advocated Arab nationalism, socialism, and the overthrow of the monarchy. It was illegal at the time, a fact that made membership both dangerous and appealing to young men looking for purpose. On October 7, 1959, Saddam participated in an assassination attempt against Iraq's Prime Minister, Abdul Karim Qasim. The plot failed. Qasim survived despite being hit by bullets. Several conspirators were captured and executed. Saddam fled the country with a gunshot wound to his leg. He reportedly removed the bullet himself while hiding in the desert. He made his way to Syria, then to Egypt, where the Ba'ath Party had connections. In Cairo, he enrolled in law school at the insistence of party leadership. They wanted members who could function in professional roles if the party ever came to power. Saddam attended classes but never completed his degree. What he learned in Cairo had less to do with law than with observing how power functioned in Nasser's Egypt. He returned to Iraq in 1963 after a Ba'ath Party coup overthrew and executed Qasim. The party held power for less than a year before being ousted by military officers. Saddam was arrested in 1964 and spent 2 years in prison. During that time, he networked with other Ba'athist prisoners and studied the mistakes that had cost the party control. When he was released in 1966, he was convinced that the next time the party took power, it would need to be more ruthless in eliminating threats. The opportunity came on July 17, 1968. Ba'athist officers staged another coup. This time they learned from past failures. Potential opponents were arrested immediately. The military was purged of officers whose loyalty was questionable. Saddam, though not yet 32 years old, was appointed vice president under President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Al-Bakr was the public face, an older military figure who commanded traditional respect. Saddam was the enforcer. Over the next 11 years, Saddam methodically built parallel power structures that reported to him personally, not to the president. He created the Mukhabarat, the intelligence service. He installed loyalists throughout the security apparatus. He cultivated relationships with military commanders and ensured their promotions depended on his approval. Anyone who showed signs of independent thinking disappeared. Rivals within the Ba'ath Party met various fates. Some were accused of plotting against the government and executed after show trials. Others simply vanished. Families would wake to find their relatives gone, arrested in the night by men in civilian clothes. Bodies occasionally turned up. Most didn't. By the late 1972, al-Bakr was president in name only. Saddam controlled the security forces, the intelligence agencies, and the Revolutionary Command Council. The actual work of government flowed through his office. Al-Bakr's health was declining, though whether naturally or with assistance remains a matter of speculation. On July 16, 1979, al-Bakr resigned. He cited health reasons. Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq. The transition was announced as smooth and carefully planned. In reality, Saddam had orchestrated every detail to ensure there would be no challenge. 6 days later, on July 22nd, he called an extraordinary conference of the Ba'ath Party leadership. More than 400 members gathered in the National Assembly Hall. Saddam took the podium smoking a cigar. He announced that a Syrian-led conspiracy to overthrow the government had been discovered. He read names from a list. As each name was called, security guards escorted that individual from the room. 68 people were removed. The remaining audience members stood and applauded, some with tears streaming down their faces. They understood that any hesitation would place them on the next list. The session was videotaped. Footage shows Saddam pausing occasionally to dab his eyes, performing grief over the supposed betrayal. The accused were tried immediately in closed proceedings. 22 were convicted and executed. Saddam required that members of the Revolutionary Command Council personally participate in the firing squad. No one could later claim clean hands. Everyone would be complicit. The purge sent a clear message. Opposition meant death. Hesitation meant suspicion. Complete loyalty was the only path to survival. Within weeks, Saddam had consolidated power more thoroughly than any Iraqi leader in the nation's brief history. He controlled the government. He controlled the military. He controlled the oil revenue that continued flowing at rates exceeding $20 billion annually. The Treasury answered to him. The security services answered to him. Every major decision required his approval. And immediately, he began thinking about how to display this power. Buildings could be destroyed by enemies or time, but while they stood, they announced to the world who controlled the nation's wealth. Palaces had traditionally been the province of kings and emperors. Saddam had no royal blood. His childhood home had been mud brick. That made the symbolism even more potent. He would build what kings built, but he would build more of them. The first construction contracts were issued within months of the purge. Saddam Hussein controlled Iraq. He controlled the oil revenue. And he believed that power required visible proof. Construction began within months. In 1980, as Iraq prepared for war with Iran, Saddam Hussein authorized construction of his first presidential palace. The site was in Baghdad, on the west bank of the Tigris River, in an area known as the Kark district. The Republican palace would serve as the centerpiece of a government complex that would eventually span hundreds of acres. The structure was designed to overwhelm. Plans called for over 600 rooms spread across multiple wings. The main building would rise 4 stories, with a central dome visible from miles away. The architectural style blended Islamic motifs with modern brutalism, creating something that suggested both historical grandeur and contemporary power. Materials were ordered from across the world. Marble came from quarries in Carrara, Italy, the same source Michelangelo had used for his sculptures. Brazilian granite was shipped for exterior cladding. Chandeliers were commissioned from craftsmen in Czechoslovakia, each one containing hundreds of crystal pieces and requiring months to assemble. The fixtures alone cost millions. Iraqi workers provided most of the labor. Construction crews were recruited from across the country, often with little choice in the matter. Young men received notices to report for palace construction duty. Refusal meant investigation by the Mukhabarat. Families understood that resistance was not an option. The pay was irregular and minimal. Workers lived in temporary housing near construction sites. Meals were provided, but barely adequate. 12-hour days were standard. Accidents were common. Safety equipment was scarce. Men fell from scaffolding or were crushed by equipment. The injured were replaced immediately. Foreign expertise was brought in for specialized work. Architects from France and Germany drafted plans. Saddam insisted their involvement remain confidential. He wanted Iraqis to believe he alone had conceived these monuments. The foreign professionals signed agreements forbidding them from taking credit for their work. Most complied. The fees were substantial enough to justify anonymity. On September 22, 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. The war would continue for 8 years. It would cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives and consume vast amounts of national treasure. Palace construction did not slow. If anything, it accelerated. Saddam's paranoia about assassination intensified during the war. A single palace was too predictable. If enemies knew where he slept, he was vulnerable. The solution was to build multiple residences, and rotate unpredictably between them. By 1982, 3 additional palaces were under construction in Baghdad alone. Each compound followed the same pattern: a main residence with hundreds of rooms, guest houses for visitors, barracks for security forces, underground bunkers connected by tunnels, swimming pools, artificial lakes, gardens designed by landscape architects brought in from Europe. The grounds typically spanned 30 to 50 acres, surrounded by high walls and guard towers. The scale multiplied across Iraq. Palaces went up in Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, more in Mosul, several near Basra in the south. Babylon received a palace, built deliberately near the ancient ruins, a symbolic claim connecting Saddam to Mesopotamian kings. Each location required years of construction and millions in expenditure. The average cost per palace exceeded $50 million. The larger compounds approached $150 million. These figures covered construction only. Interior decoration added substantially more. Each palace needed furniture, carpets, artwork, china, silverware, and linens. Saddam demanded luxury throughout. Gold-plated bathroom fixtures became standard. Doors were made from imported hardwoods and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Ceilings featured elaborate plasterwork, painted in colors that required dozens of coats to achieve the desired effect. The main halls were designed to echo, amplifying the sound of footsteps and making visitors feel small in the vast spaces. Many palaces were never fully completed. Construction would reach a certain point, then shift to a newer project that had captured Saddam's attention. Half-finished wings stood empty while workers moved to the next site. The abandoned sections deteriorated from exposure to weather and neglect. The Iran-Iraq War ended in August of 1988. Estimates place Iraqi casualties between 250,000 and 500,000 dead. The economy was devastated. Iraq owed over $80 billion in foreign debt. Infrastructure throughout the country needed repair. Hospitals lacked medicine. Schools needed rebuilding. Palace construction continued. In August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The international response was swift. The United Nations imposed comprehensive sanctions. Iraqi assets abroad were frozen. Exports of Iraqi oil were banned. Imports of most goods were prohibited. The stated goal was to force Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait and prevent future aggression. The sanctions remained in effect after Iraq was expelled from Kuwait in 1991. They would continue throughout the 1,990 seconds. The humanitarian impact was severe. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines. Water treatment facilities broke down and couldn't be repaired without imported parts. Electricity generation fell. Food became scarce. The United Nations established an Oil for Food program in 1995, allowing limited oil sales to purchase humanitarian supplies. The program was meant to alleviate civilian suffering while maintaining pressure on the regime. It was also massively corrupt. Saddam manipulated contracts and skimmed billions from oil sales meant for food and medicine. Some of that money went to palace construction. During the worst years of sanctions, when child mortality rates in Iraq climbed to levels not seen in decades, new palaces were being built. The juxtaposition was obscene. Children died from easily treatable diseases, while Italian stonemasons installed marble in palace bathrooms. International weapons inspectors documented the construction. They could see the palaces from satellite imagery. New compounds appeared in areas where none had existed before. The spending was obvious. The priorities were clear. Estimates of total workers involved in palace construction over 2 decades exceed 100,000. Most received minimal compensation. Many were conscripted. The skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, and artisans who created the decorative elements were Iraqi. Their work was exceptional. Under different circumstances, these palaces might have been celebrated as achievements of Iraqi craftsmanship. Instead, they became symbols of stolen wealth and misplaced priorities. By 2003, Iraq had 80 presidential palaces. The total cost exceeded $2 billion. Adjusted for inflation and calculated against Iraq's GDP during the construction period, the figure represents an even more staggering percentage of national wealth. The money could have built thousands of schools. It could have equipped hundreds of hospitals. It could have modernized infrastructure that was instead left to decay. The palaces were complete, or complete enough. Now they would serve their true purpose, not as homes, but as instruments of power and fear. Saddam Hussein never slept in the same palace twice in 1 week. The rotation was unpredictable, decided at the last moment, sometimes changed while his motorcade was already moving. Security personnel received notice with only hours to prepare. The pattern reflected his deepest fear. Assassins needed to know where he would be. If his location remained uncertain, he remained alive. Each of the 80 palaces was staffed and maintained as if he might arrive at any moment. Cooks prepared meals that often went uneaten. Cleaning crews kept rooms spotless that no one entered. Gardens were manicured. Swimming pools were cleaned and heated. The electricity stayed on. Climate control systems ran continuously to prevent humidity damage to furnishings and artwork. The waste was staggering. But waste was the point. Only someone with unlimited resources could afford to maintain 80 fully operational residences. Security at each location was handled by the Republican Guard, elite units selected for loyalty to Saddam personally rather than to Iraq as a nation. Guard rotations were assigned to specific palaces. They lived in barracks on the grounds. Promotions and assignments were rewards. Dismissal meant investigation, and often worse. Every guard understood that failure to protect the palace, even one Saddam might never visit, could result in their family being interrogated. Underground bunkers existed beneath many of the larger palaces. Construction details were classified, but defectors later described elaborate systems. Reinforced concrete walls several meters thick. Air filtration systems designed to withstand chemical or biological attack. Communication centers with encrypted lines to military command posts across Iraq. Escape tunnels leading to secondary exits outside palace walls. Some tunnels reportedly extended hundreds of meters, emerging in residential neighborhoods where vehicles could be waiting. The palaces served propaganda purposes as effectively as security ones. When foreign diplomats visited Baghdad, Saddam brought them to the Republican Palace or one of the other showpiece compounds. The message was deliberate. Iraq was powerful. Iraq was wealthy. The leader who commanded these resources was not someone to be underestimated or threatened. European and Arab diplomats walked through marble halls and sat in reception rooms where every surface announced money and permanence. Iraqi citizens were forbidden from approaching palace grounds. Security perimeters extended miles beyond the actual walls. Checkpoints stopped traffic on roads that came anywhere near palace compounds. Residents of neighborhoods adjacent to palaces required special identification to reach their own homes. Anyone without authorization who wandered too close was detained. Repeat, offenders disappeared. The staff who worked inside the palaces were selected through security screenings that could take months. Background checks extended to parents, siblings, cousins, and childhood friends. Any hint of disloyalty or foreign connection disqualified candidates. Even those who passed screening understood their families served as insurance. If a cook or gardener betrayed the regime, their relatives would pay the price. The leverage was explicit and effective. The contrast between palace luxury and national deprivation became obscene during the 1,990 seconds. UN sanctions prevented Iraq from importing most goods. Hospitals ran out of antibiotics, painkillers, and surgical equipment. When equipment broke, replacement parts couldn't be imported. Doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia. Patients died from infections that would have been easily treatable in earlier decades. Baghdad's sewage system collapsed in sections. Pumping stations failed. Treatment plants stopped functioning. Raw sewage flowed into the Tigris River, the same water source millions depended on for drinking water. Waterborne diseases spread. Child mortality rates climbed to levels not seen since the 1,960 seconds. UNICEF documented the humanitarian catastrophe. In 1989, before sanctions, infant mortality in Iraq was 47 deaths per 1,000 live births. By 1999, the rate had risen to 108 deaths per 1,000 live births. The increase represented tens of thousands of preventable deaths annually. Malnutrition contributed to most cases. Contaminated water caused many others. Lack of medicine meant treatable conditions became fatal. Palace maintenance continued, without interruption. The gold-plated bathroom fixtures in Saddam's residences were polished regularly. The crystal chandeliers were cleaned by workers on scaffolding, who spent days on a single fixture. The imported marble floors were washed and buffed. The grounds were maintained by teams of gardeners who kept the grass trimmed, the flowers watered, and the artificial lakes stocked with ornamental fish. Swimming pools at multiple palaces were maintained year-round, despite chronic water shortages affecting Iraqi agriculture. The Euphrates and Tigris river systems were experiencing reduced flow due to drought and upstream damming by Turkey. Farmers struggled to irrigate crops. Rice paddies in the south dried up. But palace pools remained full, their water chemically treated and temperature controlled. The Al-Fa Palace, south of Baghdad, was Saddam's largest, completed in the late 1992 at the height of sanctions. The main building alone covered over 600,000 square feet. 4 smaller palaces sat at the corners of the complex. An artificial lake surrounded the grounds. The construction reportedly cost over $100 million. The timing was deliberate. Saddam wanted to demonstrate that sanctions had not weakened his position. While Iraqi children died from malnutrition, he built the largest palace in the entire collection. The Babylon Palace was constructed deliberately near ancient ruins, the archaeological site where Nebuchadnezzar had ruled over 2,500 years earlier. Saddam saw himself as heir to Mesopotamian kings. He commissioned bricks, inscribed with his name, to be added to the ancient structures, a gesture archaeologists condemned as vandalism. The palace, overlooking the ruins, reinforced the connection he wanted to claim between himself and the legendary rulers of Babylon. Defectors who had worked in palace administration later provided cost estimates. Each palace required between $3 million and $5 million annually just for basic maintenance. Multiply that by 80 palaces over 2 decades, and the total exceeds $5 billion. That figure covered only routine upkeep, not construction costs or major renovations. The money came from oil revenues and from funds diverted from the Oil for Food program that was supposed to provide humanitarian relief. The palaces functioned exactly as Saddam intended. They demonstrated power to foreign visitors. They provided security through unpredictability. They employed thousands of Iraqis, whose livelihoods depended on regime loyalty. They announced to anyone who saw them, or even heard about them, that the man who built them controlled wealth and power beyond challenge. But the fortress system had a weakness. The palaces made Saddam seem invincible. They also made him a target. August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces crossed into Kuwait shortly after midnight. Within hours, they controlled Kuwait City. Saddam claimed the emirate as Iraq's 19th province and installed a puppet government. The international response formed quickly. The United Nations Security Council condemned the invasion. Economic sanctions were imposed within days. Saddam miscalculated. He believed the world would accept the annexation as a fait accompli, the way it had accepted other Middle Eastern border changes. He was wrong. President George H.W. Bush assembled a coalition of 35 nations, 500,000 troops deployed to Saudi Arabia. The buildup continued through the fall of 1990. On January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began with aerial bombardment. Coalition aircraft struck military installations, communication centers, and government facilities across Iraq. Baghdad experienced sustained bombing for the first time since the Iran-Iraq War. Some strikes hit near palace compounds. The Republican Palace suffered damage to outer buildings. Shrapnel scarred marble walls. Windows shattered from concussive force. Most palaces were not primary targets. Coalition planners focused on military assets, command centers, and infrastructure supporting Iraqi forces in Kuwait. The palaces held symbolic importance but limited strategic value. Bombing them would accomplish little militarily, while potentially creating problems diplomatically. Saddam remained hidden, rotating between bunkers and undamaged palace facilities. The ground campaign began February 24th. It lasted 100 hours. Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait with overwhelming speed. By February 28th, a ceasefire was in effect. Iraq had lost tens of thousands of soldiers. The military infrastructure was devastated, but Saddam retained power. The ceasefire agreement included specific terms. Iraq would destroy all chemical and biological weapons. Ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 150 kilometers would be eliminated. Nuclear weapons programs would be dismantled. The United Nations Special Commission, UNSCOM, would verify compliance through inspections. Inspectors arrived in 1991. They encountered immediate resistance. Iraqi officials delayed access to facilities. Documents were removed before inspection teams arrived. Sites were sanitized. When inspectors demanded entry to suspected weapons storage locations, Iraqi authorities claimed sovereignty violations and refused. The palaces became the most contentious issue. Saddam declared all presidential palace compounds off-limits to inspectors. He claimed they were sovereign territory, comparable to embassies. International law regarding heads of state gave him some basis for the argument, though UNSCOM maintained that Security Council resolutions superseded normal diplomatic protocols. Inspectors suspected that palace compounds were being used to hide prohibited weapons or research. The facilities were large enough to conceal entire laboratories. Underground bunkers could store chemical or biological agents. Transport between palaces could move materials ahead of inspection teams. The palace network provided exactly the kind of shell game needed to evade verification. Throughout the 1,990 seconds, the standoff continued. UNSCOM teams demanded palace access. Iraqi officials refused. Negotiations produced temporary compromises where limited inspections occurred under Iraqi supervision. The inspectors saw what they were allowed to see, which was never enough to satisfy their mandate. The Radwanaya presidential complex west of Baghdad became a particular focus. Intelligence suggested weapons-related activity. Inspectors requested access repeatedly. Each request was denied or delayed for months. When access was finally granted in 1998, after intense diplomatic pressure, the compound had been thoroughly cleaned. No evidence of prohibited materials was found, but inspectors noted that sufficient time had passed to remove anything that might have been there. In December 1998, after years of obstruction, UNSCOM withdrew its personnel from Iraq. The stated reason was that Iraq was not cooperating in good faith. Hours after inspectors departed, Operation Desert Fox began. American and British forces conducted 4 days of bombing targeting suspected weapons facilities and military infrastructure. Several palace compounds were hit. The strikes demonstrated that the sanctuaries Saddam had declared inviolable could be reached. Inspectors did not return. From 1998 through 2003, Iraq remained closed to weapons verification. Palace construction continued during this period. Satellite imagery tracked new compounds under development. The spending was obvious despite sanctions that were meant to be crippling Iraqi finances. The Oil for Food program, established to allow limited oil sales for humanitarian supplies, became a source of regime funding. UN investigators later estimated that Saddam's government skimmed approximately $2 billion through various schemes. Kickbacks on contracts, surcharges on oil sales, and manipulation of exchange rates all funneled money back to regime coffers. Some of that money funded palace construction and maintenance. September 11, 2001 changed the geopolitical landscape. The Bush administration began making the case that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat to regional stability. The palace compounds where inspectors had been denied access became evidence in arguments for military action. If Iraq had nothing to hide, why refuse inspection? The logic was persuasive to many, though whether weapons actually existed remained an open question. By 2002, diplomatic efforts to force Iraqi compliance had failed. The United States began military preparations. Troops deployed to Kuwait. Equipment moved into position. Saddam remained in his palaces, rotating between them unpredictably, convinced that his system would protect him as it always had. In March of 2003, American forces crossed into Iraq from Kuwait. Within weeks, they would discover what Saddam had built, and within months, he would be in hiding. March 20th, 2003. Operation Iraqi Freedom began at 5:34 a.m. Baghdad time with cruise missile strikes targeting Iraqi leadership. The opening salvo was followed by waves of aerial bombardment. Military installations, government buildings, and communication centers were hit throughout the night. The campaign planners called it shock and awe. The intent was to overwhelm Iraqi defenses so quickly that organized resistance would collapse. Ground forces crossed from Kuwait into southern Iraq within hours. The 3rd Infantry Division moved toward Baghdad along Highway 8. The 1st Marine Division advanced from the east. British forces secured the Basra region. Iraqi military units offered sporadic resistance but were outmatched in equipment, training, and coordination. Some units simply abandoned their positions. By March 21st, coalition forces controlled southern oil fields. On March 23rd, they were within 50 miles of Baghdad. Iraqi forces attempted a stand at several locations. The battles were brief and one-sided. American armor and air support destroyed Iraqi positions with minimal coalition casualties. April 5, 2003, U.S. forces reached Baghdad International Airport. They renamed it Baghdad International Airport within hours of securing it. The airport became a staging area for the final push into the capital. Saddam appeared on Iraqi television, but intelligence suggested the footage might have been recorded earlier. His actual location was unknown. April 9, 2003, American tanks entered central Baghdad. The Republican Palace, the centerpiece of Saddam's palace network, fell without significant fighting. Marines raised an American flag over the compound briefly before officers ordered it removed to avoid the appearance of conquest rather than liberation. Iraqi civilians rushed into streets. In Firdos Square, a crowd gathered around a large statue of Saddam. U.S. Marines assisted in pulling it down with an armored vehicle. The images were broadcast worldwide. The Republican Palace became coalition military headquarters within days. American commanders walked through marble halls where Saddam had hosted foreign dignitaries. They found throne rooms with gilded furniture, conference halls with crystal chandeliers, bathrooms with gold-plated fixtures. The excess was documented in photographs and soldier accounts. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Brian McCoy told reporters his initial reaction was disbelief. The palace contained more luxury in a single wing than most Iraqis saw in a lifetime. The contrast between what Saddam had built for himself and what his people endured was impossible to ignore. Looting began almost immediately. Local Iraqis who had been forbidden from approaching palace grounds for decades rushed in. They stripped fixtures from walls. They carried away furniture, carpets, and anything portable with value. Light fixtures were removed. Faucets were unscrewed from bathroom sinks. Within days, many palaces were shells, their interiors picked clean. American forces secured the larger compounds, but couldn't protect all 80 palaces simultaneously. Some in remote areas were left unguarded. Looters took everything. In Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, several palace compounds were thoroughly ransacked. Only the marble floors and tiled walls remained, too heavy and difficult to remove quickly. The Al-Fa Palace, south of Baghdad, Saddam's largest compound, was secured by the 101st Airborne Division. Soldiers moved into rooms designed for dictatorial luxury. They set up cots under crystal chandeliers. They established command posts in reception halls. The juxtaposition of military gear against opulent decoration created surreal scenes documented in hundreds of photographs. Search teams began looking for weapons of mass destruction. Intelligence had suggested palace compounds might house chemical or biological weapons or research facilities. Teams examined bunkers beneath palaces. They searched underground tunnels, They inspected laboratories and storage facilities within palace grounds. They found nothing. No chemical weapons, no biological agents, no active nuclear program beyond documentation of past efforts abandoned years earlier. The palaces contained luxury and excess, but not the weapons that had been used to justify the invasion. Saddam had fled Baghdad before it fell. Intelligence placed him in various locations, but confirmed sightings were rare. He moved between safe houses, relying on loyalists to hide him. The man who had built 80 palaces to ensure he always had a secure location now slept in borrowed beds in anonymous houses. The manhunt intensified through the summer and fall of 2003. Special operations forces raided locations across Iraq based on intelligence tips. Many raids yielded nothing. Others captured members of Saddam's inner circle who provided additional leads. The circle tightened. December 13, 2003. Acting on intelligence from a detainee, American forces raided a farm near Tikrit. They searched buildings and found nothing. Then someone noticed a styrofoam and dirt cover hiding a small opening in the ground. Soldiers pulled it away, revealing a hole barely large enough for a person. They called down. Someone was inside. Saddam Hussein emerged from what soldiers immediately labeled a spider hole. The entrance was about 6 feet deep. The chamber at the bottom was perhaps 8 feet long. He had been hiding there with 2 AK-47 rifles, a pistol, and 750,000 inches cash. He was dirty, bearded, and disheveled. His capture was broadcast globally within hours. The irony was complete. Saddam had spent over $2 billion building 80 palaces, each designed to project power and provide security. When American forces came, he abandoned all of them. He was captured hiding in a hole in the ground on a farm near the village where he was born. The palaces had failed to protect him. The billions spent on marble and gold and crystal had bought nothing that mattered when survival was at stake. He had believed architectural grandeur would make him invincible. Instead, he ended his freedom in a dirt hole covered with styrofoam. Saddam was held at a U.S. military facility while charges were prepared. In 2004, he was transferred to Iraqi custody. His trial began in October 2005 on charges including crimes against humanity for the killing of 148 Shiite villagers in Dujail in 1982. The proceedings stretched over a year. On November 5, 2006, Saddam was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. Appeals were rejected. On December 30, 2006, the sentence was carried out at a military facility in northern Baghdad. He was 69 years old. The palaces survived the invasion better than Saddam did. American forces moved in, and for the next 8 years, Iraq's monuments to dictatorship became something else entirely. In the Republican Palace, marble halls that once hosted Saddam Hussein's inner circle became the headquarters of the Coalition Provisional Authority, L. Paul Bremer III was appointed administrator in May 2003. He operated from offices that had belonged to senior Ba'ath Party officials. The throne room where Saddam had received foreign dignitaries was converted into a briefing room for military commanders. The transformation was both practical and symbolic. The palace compounds offered secure, centralized facilities for coalition operations. The infrastructure existed. The buildings were substantial enough to withstand attack. Using them sent a message that the regime's symbols of power now served new purposes. The Republican Palace became the Green Zone's administrative center. Military personnel and civilian contractors worked in offices once reserved for Iraq's elite. Conference rooms that had hosted party meetings became planning centers for reconstruction efforts. The ballroom, designed for state dinners, was divided into workspace for hundreds of employees. Other palace compounds received similar treatment. The Victory Base complex was established around several palaces south of Baghdad near the airport. At its peak, the complex housed over 40,000 military personnel and contractors. The palaces served as command centers, living quarters, and administrative facilities. Temporary structures were erected on palace grounds to accommodate the massive American presence. The Al-Fa Palace, Saddam's largest compound, became a recreation center for American forces. The main building, which had cost over $100 million to construct, was transformed into a dining facility and lounge. Soldiers ate meals under crystal chandeliers. They played video games in rooms where Saddam had planned to entertain heads of state. The swimming pool was maintained. Basketball courts were installed on the grounds. The palace that symbolized Iraq's stolen wealth became a rest area for troops. Soldiers adapted to the surreal environment. They slept in rooms with marble floors and gilded fixtures. They walked past ornate archways, carrying assault rifles. Photographs from the period show troops in combat gear standing beneath chandeliers or sitting on palace steps in full armor. The juxtaposition created images that captured the strangeness of the occupation. Graffiti appeared on palace walls. American soldiers left marks indicating their units had been there. Names, dates, insignias. Some was simple vandalism. Some was soldiers documenting their presence in history. The marble that had been installed at such expense now bore spray-painted messages. The maintenance requirements remained substantial. Climate control systems needed to run continuously to protect the structures from humidity damage. The Italian marble required regular cleaning. The chandeliers needed maintenance. The U.S. military contracted with companies to preserve the palaces. Estimates suggest millions of dollars annually were spent maintaining facilities that served primarily as symbols rather than essential infrastructure. Iraqi civilians remained largely excluded from palace grounds, though now for security reasons rather than political ones. The Green Zone, which encompassed several palace compounds, became a fortified area accessible only to coalition personnel and vetted Iraqis. Checkpoints controlled access. Blast walls surrounded the perimeter. Local residents who had been forbidden from approaching palaces during Saddam's rule found themselves still forbidden, just under different authority. The Radwanaya presidential complex became a U.S. military base. Soldiers established living quarters in wings that had been designed for Saddam's guests. The underground bunkers that Saddam had built for protection from attack now served American forces for the same purpose. The escape tunnels were mapped and secured. In Tikrit, palaces that had been looted after the invasion were partially restored and occupied by American forces. The 4th Infantry Division used several palace compounds as bases. Soldiers described walking through rooms stripped of fixtures but still featuring the elaborate tile work and marble that had been too difficult for looters to remove. The absurdity was not lost on the troops. Many came from working-class backgrounds in American cities and rural towns. They found themselves living in luxury that would have been unimaginable in their home lives, yet they were living as soldiers in a war zone. The gold bathroom fixtures and crystal chandeliers existed alongside military cots and weaponry. Some palaces were used for detention and interrogation. Abu Ghraib prison, though not technically a palace, became notorious for abuse of detainees in 2004. Several palace compounds housed detention facilities, where captured insurgents were held and questioned. The rooms designed for luxury became spaces for interrogation. By 2008, American troop levels began declining. The surge of 2007 had added forces temporarily, but the overall trend was withdrawal. Palaces that had housed thousands of personnel were gradually emptied. Equipment was removed. Temporary structures were dismantled. The compounds were prepared for transfer to Iraqi government control. The withdrawal accelerated through 2009 and 2010. Palace compounds were handed over to Iraqi security forces. Some became Iraqi military bases. Others were designated for government use. The Republican Palace was transferred to the Iraqi government and became part of the government complex in Baghdad. On December 18, 2011, the last American combat troops left Iraq. The occupation that had begun in March 2003 ended after nearly 9 years. The palaces that had served as coalition headquarters, military bases, and recreation centers were now Iraqi property again. The cost of maintaining palaces during the American occupation was never fully calculated, but estimates suggest it exceeded 100 million over 8 years. The money went to contractors for climate control, structural preservation, and basic upkeep. The same economic burden that had made the palaces unsustainable for Saddam's successors had simply been transferred to American taxpayers. When American forces departed in 2011, they left behind 80 palaces in various states of use and disrepair. The question became, what does Iraq do with monuments to the man who nearly destroyed it? Today, of Saddam's 80 palaces, no two share the same fate. The variety of outcomes reflects Iraq's struggle with these monuments to dictatorship. Some serve the government, others decay in abandonment. A few have been destroyed entirely. The rest exist in various states between functional use and slow collapse. The Republican Palace remains the most prominent. It serves as part of the government complex in Baghdad's international zone. The Iraqi Prime Minister's offices occupy wings that once housed Saddam's inner circle. Government ministries use other sections. The marble halls where coalition forces once operated now host Iraqi bureaucrats conducting the work of governing. The building functions, but its symbolism creates discomfort for many who work there. The Al-Faw Palace, south of Baghdad, became an Iraqi military installation after American withdrawal. Portions of the massive compound were opened as a museum in 2016. Visitors can walk through rooms that display photographs of the palace's construction, its use by Saddam, its occupation by American forces, and its current status. The exhibition attempts to contextualize the palace as historical artifact rather than celebrating it. Attendance has been modest. Many Iraqis have no interest in touring monuments to the regime that oppressed them. Several palaces in Basra were converted to public use. One houses a museum dedicated to Iraqi history. Another serves as a cultural center. The conversions required substantial investment that the cash-strapped provincial government could barely afford. Maintenance remains an ongoing challenge. The buildings require constant climate control to prevent humidity damage. Basra's location near the Persian Gulf makes this especially expensive. Many palaces were simply abandoned after 2011. Without American funding for upkeep and with Iraqi government resources stretched thin, the compounds were left to deteriorate. Looters returned. They stripped copper wiring from walls. They removed remaining fixtures. In some locations, they used heavy equipment to extract marble flooring and wall panels. The scale of destruction exceeded what had occurred immediately after the 2003 invasion. Between 2014 and 2017, ISIS controlled large portions of northern and western Iraq. Several palaces in these regions were destroyed. The group released videos showing explosives being placed in palace buildings. The detonations were filmed and published as propaganda, demonstrating their rejection of Saddam's legacy and their contempt for what they considered symbols of secular nationalism. At least 5 major palace compounds were damaged or destroyed during this period. Other palaces fell under control of various militia groups during the chaos following American withdrawal. Iranian-backed Shiite militias occupied several compounds. They used them as bases and training facilities. The Iraqi government lacked the strength to challenge these occupations. By the late 2010s, some of these palaces remained in militia hands, functioning as de facto independent facilities outside government control. A few palace compounds were sold to private developers. The land alone was valuable. In Baghdad and other major cities, 30 to 50-acre parcels in central locations could fetch substantial prices. Developers purchased several properties with plans to demolish the palaces and construct commercial or residential projects. Some of these plans moved forward. Others stalled when developers discovered the cost of demolition and the complexity of clearing such large structures. The looting that began in 2003 never truly stopped. Through the 2010s, organized theft continued at abandoned palace sites. Teams arrived with trucks and tools. They ripped ornamental metalwork from gates. They removed decorative plasterwork from ceilings. They chiseled tile work from walls. The Italian marble proved especially valuable. Slabs were extracted and sold. often ending up in private homes or businesses across Iraq and neighboring countries. The economic reality confronting Iraq was stark. Maintaining all 80 palaces would cost an estimated 100 to 150 million annually. The figure covered basic upkeep only, not restoration or renovation. Iraq's government budget faced far more pressing needs. Hospitals lacked equipment, schools needed rebuilding, infrastructure damaged during years of war required repair. Spending millions to preserve Saddam's palaces was politically impossible. Debate emerged about what should be done with the structures. Some argued for preservation as historical sites. The palaces documented a specific period of Iraqi history, however terrible. Future generations should be able to see what the regime built and understand what it cost. Destroying the evidence would erase lessons that needed remembering. Others advocated for complete demolition. The palaces represented stolen wealth and national trauma. Every dollar spent on maintenance was a dollar not spent on schools or hospitals. The buildings served no useful purpose. Removing them would free valuable land for development that could actually benefit Iraqi citizens. Tourism offered a potential economic justification for preservation. If marketed properly, the palace sites could attract visitors and generate revenue. Iraq possessed remarkable historical and cultural treasures, but decades of war and instability had destroyed its tourism industry. Could Saddam's palaces help rebuild it? The question sparked uncomfortable discussions about whether monuments to dictatorship should become tourist attractions. Beginning around 2015, several palaces were open to the public for limited tours. Iraqis could visit with proper authorization. The experience proved emotionally complex for many. Older visitors remembered when approaching palace grounds meant risking death. They walked through halls their parents had been forbidden to see. Some felt anger at the waste. Others experienced sadness at what Iraq had lost during those decades. A few simply found the architecture impressive, divorced from its context. Younger Iraqis, born during or after Saddam's rule, often viewed the palaces with curiosity rather than strong emotion. They had grown up hearing about the regime but had limited direct experience with it. The buildings were historical artifacts, no different from ancient Mesopotamian ruins. This generational divide complicated efforts to determine appropriate uses for the sites. The palaces themselves represented a profound contradiction. They were built with stolen wealth by a dictator who starved his own people. But the craftsmen who created them were Iraqi. The stonemasons, tile workers, carpenters, and artisans who installed the marble and carved the decorative elements possessed real skill. Their work, however tainted by its purpose, represented Iraqi craftsmanship. The materials were part of the national heritage now, regardless of how they came to be assembled. The final accounting of what the palaces cost extends beyond the estimated $2 billion spent on construction and maintenance between 1979 and 2003. During that same period, Iraq's infrastructure collapsed. The GDP per capita fell from modest prosperity to poverty levels. Hospitals that had been well equipped in the 1970 seconds deteriorated until they could barely function. Schools lost funding and quality, water treatment systems broke down, electrical generation became unreliable. The counterfactual haunts Iraqi economists and policymakers. If the $2 billion had been invested in education, how many additional doctors, engineers, and teachers would Iraq have produced? If spent on healthcare infrastructure, how many lives would have been saved? If directed toward economic development, what industries might have been built? The questions have no answers, only the persistent weight of opportunity cost. Iraq's oil wealth in the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds had created a moment of genuine possibility. The nation could have developed human capital and infrastructure that would have generated prosperity for generations. Instead, one man channeled billions into personal monuments. The palaces stand as physical evidence of that choice and its consequences. By the early 2020 seconds, most of the 80 palaces existed in some state of decay. A handful served government or military functions. Several operated as museums or cultural centers. Many sat abandoned, their interiors stripped, their exteriors crumbling from neglect and weather damage. A few had been demolished or destroyed. The remainder occupied a liminal state between preservation and collapse, their futures uncertain. The legacy question remains unresolved. Should Iraq invest scarce resources to preserve buildings that symbolize oppression and waste? Or should they be erased, the land repurposed for uses that serve the population? The government has avoided making a comprehensive decision. Individual palaces are addressed case by case, depending on local conditions and available funding. No national policy exists. Visitors who walk through the few palaces open to the public encounter a strange experience. The Italian marble still gleams in sections where looters haven't reached. The tile work remains impressive where it survives. The scale of the buildings still overwhelms, but the grandeur is undercut by evidence of decay. Water damage, stains, ceilings. Broken windows let in weather and birds. Graffiti marks walls. The contrast between original intention and current reality creates a melancholy atmosphere. The palaces that Saddam Hussein built to demonstrate his power and ensure his security achieved neither goal. They failed to protect him. They became symbols of regime excess that accelerated international condemnation. They consumed resources that might have secured genuine stability through investment in Iraqi society. They stand now as monuments to a specific kind of failure, the belief that architectural grandeur can substitute for legitimacy. Iraq continues to struggle with what these buildings represent and what should be done with them. The debate reflects larger questions about how nations confront difficult histories. The palaces are evidence of crimes committed against the Iraqi people. They are also undeniably part of Iraq's modern history. Whether that history should be preserved or demolished remains a question without consensus. The 80 palaces endure, slowly crumbling, serving various purposes or no purpose at all. They remain what they have always been since their completion: monuments to billions, stolen from a nation that desperately needed them for something else.